Hello listeners and welcome to the Tyrantcast. My name is Mitch and I am the Hive Tyrant. Today I'm pleased to present you with the very first of a brand new podcast style and primarily audio discussion topic centric video series. In this first inaugural episode I'm joined by not just one but two esteemed guests and we'll be engaging in an in-depth discussion of the global concept of deck building from both a basic and expert perspective. But before we delve into the topic of the episode, let's take a trip around our virtual table and introduce our guests. So starting with John, why don't you introduce yourself and let us know how you're involved in the Conquest community.
Well, hello there. I'm John Gobeil. I'm one of the admins of the Conquest Facebook group, and I help run the Toronto meta, and I've won my fair share of tournaments, so I think I know a few things about a few things. So,
well, very much appreciate your being on, and ever the humble gentleman. But in all seriousness, I think you performed very, very well at the recent Canadian National Championship. So,
thank you.
Good on you, and just honored to have you back on the show. I suppose, Parker, how about you? Who are you, our mysterious guest number 2?
Yeah, as Mitch introduced me, I'm Parker. You'll find me kind of guest spotting on podcasts here and there. I write articles every once in a while for wwpd.net about Conquest and a couple of other card games. Otherwise, I'm just, I go to tournaments in New York City and Long Island, tri-state area, I guess, because I just came back from one in Connecticut. I've got a couple of store championship victories under my belt. Unfortunately, I couldn't make any regionals or any of the nationals this year. Hopefully next year that changes, though. Otherwise, I just post every once in a while on the Facebook page.
Well, definitely. And if you happen to win one of the upcoming store championships and get your hands on one of those Swarmlord playmats, make sure to mail that to me. I'd appreciate it.
But, keeping that
one. I'm sure I'll have to eBay one. But in any case, thank you guys so much for coming on. The goal of this series was to do some sort of irregular, occasional podcast-style content, something focused around one topic. This has been a project kind of long in the works, and I figure what better way to start off than the premise of deck building. Both of you are some seasoned deck building veterans. I'm much more of a net deck player myself, so I wanted to have a couple of pros on. And I suppose whichever of you would like to start, what is your personal approach to deck building? How do you begin when you get it in your head that you'd like to try something new?
Well, for me, I'm really big on command, which is why I favor Eldorath most of the time, and I pretty much always start, obviously, with the signature squad because I don't have a choice. But the next thing I do, unless I'm playing Tau, is I put in 3 Rogue Traders, 3 Void Pirates, I guess I should say, unless I'm playing Tau or Tyranids now, 3 Rogue Traders, 3 Void Pirates, 3 promotions, and I go from there. And that's basically the core for me. And then depending on what kind of deck I'm trying to build, I'll go through that. You always sort of want to have 28 to 31, 32 units, army units.
Sure.
And then, it's just a matter of the trickiest part for me is balancing how many supports you put in, and that depends on your deck and your faction and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But it sounds at least like you just kind of start with a solid core and then build from there, like you've got your, kind of command pod of really command icon powerful units and cards that you, like, just auto-include in almost every deck.
Yeah, I mean, I find that, and maybe what works in someone else's meta is different than in mine, but I find that the basic command presence you want to have is sort of have your rogue traders, your void pirates, your promotions, and then at least one of 3 copies of a 2 command guy like a Vasha Trailblazer or a Chaos Fanatics or something like that. And if you don't have that, then it's when someone puts out a single command icon guy and you can't trump them with something, I don't know what to tell you. You're doing it wrong, or you're making a very interesting deck choice in my mind.
Sure. Well, how about you, Parker? I suppose what's your initial approach when you're trying to either build a really competitive deck or just try something original?
Similar to John, unfortunately the game is still at a point where those Void Pirates and Rogue Traders and promotions are kind of indispensable.
Sure.
So I may not necessarily end up including 3 of each in my deck, but whenever I'm using an online deck building tool and I open up the page, one of my first things is 3 of Promotion, 3 Void Pirate, 3 Rogue Trader, and if later on I have to pare it down, then I'll pare it down.
But I suppose that's just a topic worth pursuing there. So you use an online deck builder? Is it Conquest DB or Card Game DB?
So I prefer Conquest DB. I like the user interface a lot more. But whichever one you use, it's just important that you use it, I think, just so you can very easily calculate the average cost of all your units, very easily keep track of how many cards are in your deck, and keep a accurate readout of your spread between army units, events, supports, and attachments.
Right. So you kind of approach things from more of a statistical standpoint than actually having the cards, out in front of you and just doing what feels right.
For the most part, yeah.
I don't think anybody does that anymore.
Yeah.
If they're being competitive. I mean, back in the 90s, I used to play Overpower, and the internet wasn't very developed then, and it was you had your cards laid out across the floor in front of you, and you were looking at them or flipping through the pages of a binder and saying, hey, wait, if I use this with this one,
right,
it could be really great. And now it's just click, 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 and it's so much easier. There's no need. I mean, it saves you time.
Yeah.
It lets you, if you want to get all the army units that cost 2 or less, click a few filters and bing, and you got them all right in front of you.
Especially when you can just export decks directly to Octagon. I mean, it's just so easy.
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess historically, and I'm still fairly new to the actual competitive scene of Conquest, and I haven't been part of this community for too long. Certainly, I spend a lot more time making videos of other competent players than getting in practice myself. But I suppose when I approach deck building, I kind of view, just like you guys mentioned, the Void Pirates, Rogue Traders. I think there are certainly some staples almost, or not necessarily to get into a huge auto-include thing, but just based on the faction, it seems like there are cards that you just kind of default slot into your deck. And I suppose I would just personally kind of approach building a deck around, I've got these cards I essentially feel like I have to include, like Honored Librarian or Drop Pod Assault if you're a Space Marines player, and then just kind of figure out what works with the absolute most powerful cards. But I suppose just beyond simply addressing the basics, John, you mentioned having enough command icons, and we've started to touch on the cost curve. How do you guys kind of pick the cards that you do when you go to actually fill out a deck of 50 cards?
Well, I mean, I primarily use Card Game DB, and I think it was because everyone seems to think that Conquest DB is better. My problem is I just got used to Card Game DB, and so if I look at Conquest DB, it sort of seems foreign to me. Generally, what I do, I don't know if it's strange or not, but I add in the basics. I will start with Card Game DB. I pick my Warlord, and then I just sort of click on support, and I look at the supports, and I'll add a couple in. Typically, I don't play decks that have many supports,
Sure.
And then I go up the list. I go, okay, what events do I want? And I'll put a bunch of them in, and just say these would be nice, right? And then attachments and so on. And eventually, I go to army units, and I'll go in and I'll say, okay, let's look at the cost 0 army units. Are there any I want to include? No, or if there were any. And then I go cost 1, and I'll with my Eldorath deck, I go BL10s, Rogue Traders, some Slith Mercenaries, some Void Pirates, and I sort of add in all the stuff, generally up to 3 or 4 maybe, depending on the deck, that I'm interested in. And then I take a look over at the side and I say, okay, I've got 65 cards. I need to do something about this.
Right.
So how many arm units do I have? I have 38 arm units. Let's see what I don't need, and I'll go through my list there and say, okay, well, I really want these and these and these, but I don't necessarily need 3 of those, so maybe I'll set this down to 2 or take out these guys or whatever. And then, if my army units are at 28 or 30 or somewhere around there and I'm still over, then I need to start looking at other things. And I mean, like with my Eldrath deck in particular, there's not a lot of wiggle room in regards to attachments and supports, because the attachments is basically just the signature attachment and promotions, and then supports is just the signature support. So it all comes down to arm units and events. And so, you ask yourself things like, okay, I really like Doom. Do I have room for a Doom in here? If I take it out, am I going to regret it? That sort of stuff. I've been messing around lately with trying to figure out what to do with Autarch Salacia and Subdual. And, I typically what I would do, or what I've done lately is I've just said, okay, well, let's see if they're good. So I just take my 50-card deck, I add a couple Subduals and an Autarch on top of it, and play a few games.
Sure.
And when they come up, if they're useful, then great. Like I had a game where I played Subdual and I only discarded it for a shield, and then that was it. Right. So, in certain situations, I guess I'm getting a little off topic, but in certain situations it's really useful, but those situations might not come up much, so I might just cut that back out. And eventually you get back down to 50 and you give it a whirl.
Yeah. Well, I suppose before we hear from Parker, I'll just say just another little thing I've heard about people doing in regard to deck testing or experimentation is they'll maybe just play with a conventional hand of cards and ensure that 1 or 2 of those cards happens to be what they're specifically wanting to test out, or they've got like a sideboard of cards where they can kind of swap in that card they're interested in testing. So it's a little bit removed, it's a little bit artificial or contrived, but it at least guarantees those cards will see play in potentially the perfect opportunity. But how about you, Parker? Like, what inspires you to pick the cards to fill out a 50-card deck?
Well, by and large, again, because the game is so young, a lot of the decks kind of look the same. Like, I really don't think you're going to find a whole lot of difference between the Kith deck that won Canadian Nationals and the Kith deck that, maybe controversially won U.S. Nationals.
You went there.
Yeah, just by and large, you're not going to see a lot of difference between the top tier decks. So a lot of times, what I try to do is, what can I do differently that's still going to be effective?
Sure.
And so for this last tournament, I brought Kato, which is kind of cheesy.
Different, but effective.
Yeah. But I brought him because I felt like he can, because of how he can support his own economy, he would be able to support kind of like a weird experimentation that I did. And so in this tournament, I took the new event, Vengeance, and I took more elites and big units than I think you would normally see. But again, Kato can pay for them.
Sure.
So when I built that deck, I immediately said, I want to try Vengeance. That's in. That's non-negotiable. That's going in 3 cards in my event slot. And then I looked in the elites and the big units, and I said, I want this, and I want this. And depending on how many of those, it was going to be 2 minimum of those big units that I wanted for each of them. So I said, no matter what happens with this deck, I am going to fit 3 copies of Vengeance and 4 copies of these elites, and the other 43 cards are just going to have to fit around that.
Yeah.
That might be a weird case, but when you're experimenting and stuff, you have to kind of go in with a clear goal of what you want your deck to, like what's your goal with this deck? That's basically what you have to ask yourself before you build.
Well, definitely. I think you happen to mention that our card pool is still very much growing. It's still, kind of burgeoning, developing. We've only seen the release of our core set, deluxe expansion, our first complete cycle of war packs. Do you feel like between the two of you, are you normally picking cards because they're individually powerful? Like they're just, you get a lot of bang for your buck? Like Klavex War Leader certainly accomplishes a lot, whether you're playing it in in Kith or whether you're playing it in Urian, or are you building more along the lines of like synergy where you have a lot of complementary effects that all kind of work together to accomplish the same goal, kind of like you were alluding to, Parker?
I think it depends on the faction. So another thing to mention when you're deck building is basically almost, if you're sticking to 50 cards, almost 20% of your deck comes pre-built just from your warlord and his eight cards. As far like to get back to your question, as far as synergy goes, and I say it depends on the warlord because those Space Marine events like Crushing Blow, Primal Howl, Drop Pod Assault, Indomitable. It doesn't matter whether it's Kato or Ragnar; those are going in.
Sure.
In some quantity or another. Maybe you'll have one more Primal Howl in Ragnar than you will in Kato.
Right.
Maybe one more Crushing Blow. Blah blah blah. But they're going in. Whereas I don't think, for example, you would include the same events in a Zarathor deck than you would include in a Kugath deck. You're not including the same stuff that you would in a Swarmlord deck as you would in an old One-Eye deck. So I think it depends on the faction, and then it depends on the warlord.
Well, I suppose, what are your thoughts, John? Are you normally picking, like, individually powerful cards, or are you picking things that really synergize well with Eldorath, or whomever you happen to be playing?
I think I would agree with Parker in that it does depend on what you're building. There are a number of factions where, like with Eldorath, for example, the individually powerful cards is great because there's no overarching theme to the deck. But if you're building a Zarathor deck, if you want to go heavy into demon cost reduction, then you need to be looking at what the demons are.
Right.
Or if you're building a Kugath deck and you want to look at Nurgle units, like some people actually put in that. Can't remember what the name is. The Death Guard Infantry, I think it is. That is the same stats as the Khorne Berserker, but doesn't have Brutal. And the only difference is that he's a Nurgle.
Sure.
So some people will actually put him in for Nurgle synergy. Although
it's a grower, not a shower.
Yeah, but I picture there being some pretty like decks in the future where say there's a warlord that functions off of a particular keyword or something like that. So all of a sudden you're discounting typically good units because they don't have that keyword or something along those lines,
right?
Which would make it pretty interesting. But again, I think the biggest, like what Parker was touching on, is that yes, in some cases you won't put certain cards into an old One-Eye deck that you would put into Swarmlord or whatnot because there's less synergy. But there's also cases like with Tau where Kuyon Strike has literally no synergy with Shadow Sun because Shadow Sun's not running any ethereals. But yeah, I mean things like when you're looking at a Space Marines deck, you need to look at how many cards that you're putting in that are army units that cost more than 3 because they won't be eligible for Drop Pod Assault if it hits. Or if you're building a deck that revolves around Staging Ground, you want to make sure that you've got a bunch of good 2-costers because you can't stage something in if it costs more than 2.
Right.
That sort of thing. So there's a lot of considerations, and it's not as simple as just going, okay, these guys are good, these guys are good, these guys are good. Although in many cases it is.
I think something that kind of stands out for me is figuring out not just what kind of synergy your deck has, but figuring out what exactly you manage to do well, what are your strengths, and then where do your weaknesses lie. For instance, if you are running the Swarmlord, generally you don't have too much of an issue just flooding the board with Termagant tokens, so maybe the Gravid Turvagon is not the best choice for your Synapse unit. I think if you're not running a lot of infesting cards, then you probably want to pay close attention to how many Tyranid army units and various cards that you have that benefit from infestation effects. Like, I don't think a deck should be too redundant. I think for the most part, a lot of decks should be generally strong in as many areas as possible. But when it comes to building decks, And granted, where you're taking decks is always going to be changing, but do you guys primarily, like, how often is it that you just build a deck to be individually powerful, and how often is it that you actually build with an expected meta in mind, like building a deck with the anticipation that you're going to be playing against a select few decks?
Well, this past tournament, I was told previously that going up to this store in Connecticut, you're going to see a lot of Kith and a lot of On-Shi.
Sure.
Get up there, nobody's playing Kith, nobody's playing On-Shi. So most of the time when I build a deck, I just try to build a strong deck that's going to be able to handle everything. I think, eventually, like, someday I would like to go to Worlds. Someday I would like to go to Nationals. And once you're there, there's no more local meta. There's a global meta that you have to be able to account for.
Sure.
So I'm not really worried about, what are these guys from New York City bringing? I saw on their Facebook page they were talking about On-Shi last week. Am I going to face that? Nah, don't worry about that. I just try to build a good deck.
Well, and how about you, John?
Well, I mean, you can build a deck for your local meta. If you know that there's 5 or 6 people in your local meta that favor this particular warlord or these 2 warlords or similar, warlords that are big on swarm and weak to AoE or something like that. But, I mean, in general, it's not like I'm going to go to a tournament and say, okay, there's going to be a whole bunch of Zarathers there, so let me take something that can beat Zarather.
Right.
I personally just play what I want to play. If I happen to be good against many decks and weak against a couple of them, and there's a whole bunch of them there. Like one tournament I went to, I think it was only 4 rounds, and every single round was Ragnar and Kato, and I was just like, oh, no more Space Marines, for goodness sake, you're killing me. And I digress.
I think
it's
I
just
think John.
Sorry,
John. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, like Parker said about the Connecticut thing, I remember one of the people that I spoke to went to the Connecticut Regional, and it was full of a lot of On-Shi and Kith, and the Canadian Nationals had 30% of the field was Kiths, and I think in the top 8, 6 of them were Kiths or something along those lines. So, I mean, in that case, if you are going to something and you expect there to be a lot of Kith, for example, then building a relatively command-heavy deck that has some good area effect options like Chaos or something like that with Dark Eldar allies would be beneficial.
Sure.
But generally what I'll do is if there's somebody that I'm not very strong against, then I will just play who I want to play and hope that someone else knocks them out for me. And if I happen to face them, then do my best. And if I don't win, then oh well, I'll try again next time, learn from my mistakes. And if I do win, then cool. So
I think John was like one moment away from another really good point. And that's no. And you were kind of saying like you're going to play what you want to play, and not necessarily worry about your opponents when you get there, but you're going to play what you want to play. And I think if you're ever torn, when you're building a deck for a tournament, especially if you want to be competitive, it's a lot more important, in my opinion, to bring a deck that you know inside and out than it is to bring something that's like the new hotness and maybe you only have like 3 games of practice with. Like if you're worried about X deck and you know that Y deck can beat it, but you have no experience with Y deck and the tournament is tomorrow, I think it's much better if you bring your original deck and you just practice against the deck that you're afraid of than to bring a completely new deck and hope that it works out for you.
Sure. I mean, for all you know, you might suddenly start to lose matchups that used to be a complete pushover for you. So I guess just because we have a huge range of, a big swath of listeners, of viewers, ranging from expert to absolute beginner, I suppose, what are some just basic fundamentals? I feel like it's only fair to brush on that, but when you go to determine like the number of army units, attachments, supports, and certainly it's always going to vary based on what warlord you're playing, but what are just some like absolute basics to toss out there, or some general deck building rules of thumb you guys always try to follow?
50 cards.
Well, say a little bit more about that. Why is that so important to gentlemen such as ourselves?
It goes back to, and I hate to sound like a, statistics nerd, but over the course of however many dozens or hundreds of games you're going to play, it's going to help if you have as few cards as possible to maximize your probability.
Right. So you're speaking specifically about the probability of drawing like the true power cards of your deck.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
For sure.
And you want to have that minimum 50 cards, and it's going to necessitate a lot of tough choices, but in a way that it's going to help hone your deck. It's going to help make you a better player, and it doesn't mean you can never play with certain cards. It just means that sometimes if you want your deck to be the most competitive, you have to make tough decisions.
Right. It's kind of like you want it to work as close to a finely oiled machine as you can. There's not a lot of consistency. Maybe you sacrifice a little bit of variety just to make sure your deck gets up and does what it's trying to do as quickly as possible. And with really only one notable exception, I believe someone in the North American National Championship ended up doing extraordinarily well. They played like a 60-something card Dark Eldar deck, but it was a very special case, a very talented player, and I think they were going off of just having a complete abundance of shield cards. But, of course, they weren't able to win the tourney, and who knows if, statistics just happened to align like it was their lucky day, or whether or not that was, the new power deck.
Yeah.
Could have just been a bit of a fluke.
Yeah, I heard that it was a 65 or 67 card Kith deck with no allies, and people like when that first got announced, people in the Facebook group were going on about, oh, see, you don't need to do 50 cards, forget this this Church of 50 thing, and the argument from those people was that well, maybe if the guy had 50 cards in his deck, he wouldn't have come in second.
Yeah.
So who knows, right?
Sure.
But I mean, like a concrete example would be, you're playing Kith and you have 50 cards, you have a really clean deck, and you add in 2 copies of, I don't know, Slake the Thirst or something like that, right?
Right.
And how many times will you draw Slake the Thirst in your hand off command and wish that it was an Archon's Terror to help you win the battle that was coming in front of you, right?
Right.
You want to have cards in there that are useful the majority of the time, and if it's one card that is supremely useful in one very specific situation, that's really wonderful if that situation comes up, but there's no guarantee that it will even turn up in a game, and if it does, you might not have the card in hand at the time because there's only 1 or 2 of them in your deck. So
yeah, you're always digging for something in game. It's never like, oh, I got this card, I'm totally good now. Even though sometimes you might feel that way, it's, oh, I got this card. Okay, what next? What do I need next now?
Yeah.
And
for sure.
The less cards you have, the greater the chances are you're gonna find that thing.
Yeah.
But to answer your question that you originally asked here, I'm just going to pull up my deck builder. I mean, I look at Card Game DB, and it has different stats than. I guess I should say less stats than Conquest DB, and I generally will, like, if a card has if a deck has less than 20 shield icons or so, I consider that to be really weak on shields and should figure a way to get more in.
Okay.
And I generally look at, like, it's the number of army units, which should be around 30 plus or minus 2, I guess, and maybe if you're playing Kith, you can go a little bit lower because she's making chimeras everywhere. And then command, I mean, if your command, like total command icons in the deck, I should say, is less than like 28 or 30, I think that's really weak. Generally, mine again, I play in the factions that are higher on command because I really enjoy the command game, and I find that it's a lot easier to outplay your opponents when you've got a lot more cards to throw at them.
Sure.
So, typically my command is 36, 38, 40 command icons, depending on the deck. So, I mean, those are the guidelines I go by. I know that, there's other things like shields per attachment and command per unit and all that stuff. And I know Conquest DB has like the cost, and like the average cost per card, I think it is. And
Yeah,
that's interesting. I don't use that because Card Game DB doesn't have that. It just has a bar graph for the cost. But I mean, when you start by adding your army units in from lowest to highest cost, generally it's not going to matter because I mean, in the meta in Conquest, you don't play a card that costs more than 5, if that, unless you're a Chaos player or you've got some, like the Savage Warrior Prime to throw it in from a planet ability or something like that, because it's got to have a really specific purpose. Otherwise, it's just going to be Terrored or Clavexed or Furious Sicarius or Suppressified or whatever else.
Yeah.
Right. So again, just kind of building not necessarily with like the types of deck that you're going to be playing against in mind, but just general rules of thumb based on the card pool. Like elites are pretty easily countered by just myriad different effects. But like, let's say, you talked about a baseline number of army units, somewhere around like 28 to 32. What about, supports? Like we talked about the 50 card thing. Why don't you want to fill your deck with supports? Like if I'm an Astra Militarum player, say I'm allied with orcs, how come I don't want to do 3 ammo depots, 3 orc cannons, 3 Catachan outposts, 3 staging ground, all sorts of stuff like that, Inquisitorial Fortress? Why not just load my deck up with those individually powerful supports?
I find that, in general, if you've got more than 7 supports or so, you're probably going to be causing yourself trouble. The reason for that, one of the main reasons for that is that they don't have any shields. So if you go to command and you're hoping to draw some shields to help you win the upcoming battle, and you pull a Catachan outpost and a staging ground, they'll help you next turn if you're still alive then.
Right.
But immediately they're not doing anything for you. And the other thing is that supports require some setup, right? You need to pay for them. The other part of it, aside from the card draw, is that you need to be able to pay for them, right? So if you've got 6 resources and you got 4 cost worth of supports that you want to put in, but you need some units to be drawing you command instead, what's the choice, right? Like you put out 2 Catachan outposts, but you could have had a command icon on each of 3 different planets to either get yourself some cards or stop your opponent or even steal from the opponent and get them yourself if you put a 2 command icon over a single, right?
Sure.
And then on top of that, like if you had an event in your hand and you went to a planet and you got some resources, you could then afford to play the event in the combat.
Sure.
But if you have a Catachan outpost in your hand that you couldn't afford to play, you get 2 resources from command. Good job, I guess, but you're not doing anything with it until after the next HQ phase. So it's that I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, but it's that disconnect between the command phase and the deploy phase that really hurts you with supports.
Yeah. Well, and I think in the worst case of situations, too, supports are kind of slow. They're sort of reactionary. Well, maybe not reactionary in a sense, but they're very easily telegraphed. Like, if I've got 2 Catachan outposts sitting on the table, it's not only abundantly clear what I can do with those, but let's say I staging ground a Rattling Deadeye into play. I use a Catachan outpost on it. You don't use an action. I trigger a second Catachan outpost, and then use Tzeentch's Firestorm or Archon's Terror or something like that. Or, yeah, just lots of possibility for stuff to go wrong. But,
That's true, but, on the other hand, like, say you're playing a game against Kotias, right? And the first round, he puts out a Catachan and a staging ground, and he has a pretty weak command presence because of it. The first round, you're feeling pretty good because you're probably winning in command, and you're going to have a little bit of trouble in combat because if he has a unit at the first planet, it's going to be attacking for 2 more. But the thing is, each round, like I almost think of it as they add something to the HQ phase to me, because when you refresh them, not only are you getting 4 resources and 2 cards, but you're also getting +2 attack this turn on a unit of your choice.
Sure.
And you're getting, I don't know, an extra shield if you want to consider a rocky bunker or something that can prevent 1 point of armor bane. And so as the rounds go by, I find that, if you got 3 or 4 supports that are all legitimate and effective, good supports in there, it can get pretty scary. But on the other hand, you've probably fallen behind in cards and resources unless you're using those effectively. So it's pretty tricky. And I mean, you're mentioning about the Catachan outpost. Yeah, I know you got the Catachan outpost out, and that's all well and good and everything, but what the heck can I do about it? When your guy swings for 6, I'm just going to eat it in the face.
Sure.
And you don't. It's there as a threat. It's looming over your head, and you don't know. Like you send your warlord to planet 4 to kill a void pirate. Are you safe to swing at the void pirate and just expect to refresh and walk away? I don't know. I mean, I had a game where I had, what was it? It was against Kith, I think it was, and the very first play was a Murder of Razor Wings on me, and it discarded a Starbane's Council, and I had 2 resources every combat phase, and the guy was terrified to attack and kill my command units because he was expecting a Gift of Isha to bring the Starbane's Council in and crack Kith for 5. And so the whole game, he was just like, he would go in with his Chimera token and Kith and retreat Kith as his first combat action because he didn't want Kith to be exhausted at a planet. And it's one of those things where, if it's there, it's a threat looming over your head. Those supports are very much like that, like an orbital city or an ambush platform. I mean, it's like that someone is going to try to attack you at some point in time. You just don't know when, and it totally freaks you out because of it.
Fear is the mind killer, as they say.
Yeah, and I mean, that goes, we're kind of heading back to, and I hate that this might be the motto of this discussion, like, we're going back to that whole, it depends. Because, we just mentioned Orbital City. That's obviously going to be a 3 of in any on-she deck. Sure. And it's going to completely change the face of the game when you get 1 or 2 of those on the table. But,
yeah.
For how many other factions are supports really worth it? Like, John, do you run any other supports in your Eldorath deck beyond his signature support?
I spent a little bit of time playing around with the Craft World Gate to be just really tricksy, but I mean, yeah, like the factions that I play, typically, like if you play a Kato deck, I don't think I add anything except for his signature support. Eldorath, just his signature support. Even, I mean, Eldar alone, like Baharoth, I don't really think has anything but his signature support, really.
No.
There are certain factions like Orc to some degree and Astra Militarum and Tau that rely on supports, but everybody else, like Chaos, doesn't really play supports. I mean, my Zarathor deck has his signature support in it, and that's about it. I mean, I know some people like to throw in Ammo Depot, and that's a discussion in of itself, but I'm not a fan.
Yeah, we're not gonna get sidetracked on Ammo Depot.
No. So yeah, and there's about half the faction wheel that doesn't really do supports.
Yeah,
as far as I'm concerned.
It comes down to another thing too, like for so many of these supports, on the face of it, a lot of these supports are really good. But then when you're building your deck and you're trying to pare it down, and man, do I want this support or do I want this attachment or this event? And suddenly, the supports just they don't make the cut.
Well, actually, one of the supports that surprised me the most actually was Inquisitorial Fortress. I given the popularity of Archon's Terror, I was completely shocked that it didn't do better in people's decks and get put into more see more play, I guess is what I should be saying. I mean, it costs the same. It has an advantage in that it is an action and not a combat action, so you can use it in a different phase. It doesn't have the limitation of uniques.
Sure.
It's actually the only thing that can stop a Plague Beast from firing, because you can use it on the Plague Beast after it's committed to the planet as a command action and send it home. But again, it's that setup. You have to put it out.
Yeah.
It's one of those things like, okay, your opponent has put that out, and you know what? It's telegraphed. Sure, it's coming eventually. I don't know when he's going to use it. Maybe I'll use that knowledge to not put a single big unit out on a planet and expect to win with it or something. But it's going to hit me eventually. So, it's actually similar to crushing blow and that sort of thing. Like, the philosophy behind potentially not putting crushing blow into your deck because people are so scared of it that they know that it could be there, that they'll over shield, and that in of itself is enough benefit that you don't even need to include them.
Sure.
And I've done that before. Like, somebody swings at my 2 hit point unit for 1, and I don't need to shield it, but I'll shield it because he might have a crushing blow, and then my Wraith Guard is dead and doesn't get to swing for 4 armor vein or something like that. Whether he's got it in his hand or not, I need to consider that because the fact that it could kill him makes such a big difference in that particular combat that it's a huge consideration.
Right. I mean, so whether it's working in your favor, it's your opponent anticipating you having something in your deck that you might not have, or whether it's you just playing with the cognizance or awareness that your opponent might end up pulling some trick on you, whether or not they have it. I just think awareness of the limits of the card pool are just critically important. But earlier you happened to mention Ammo Depot specifically. That just makes me think of the number of specific cards people include in their deck. When you have a card that you like, you want to have some presence in your deck of that card. What are the general rules or guidelines for figuring out how many copies when it comes to like normal cards, when it comes to uniques, limited, all that different stuff?
Want to take this one, Parker?
I was trying to think of an answer as you were saying it.
I can give it a shot if you want.
It's a really good question. I don't know if there is any hard and fast rule that I use when I decide, like, I want this to be a 2 or a 3, except to say, just to practice. And every once in a while, say, man, I really wish I would have had that, and that'll make the decision for you.
Yeah. Well, and like you mentioned earlier, the motto of the episode is "It depends." I think something that makes this particularly difficult in Conquest is we've got 8 total factions. We've thus far seen, 16 total warlords, with more to come soon.
Well, personally, I think that if you want to see a card in your deck, and you think it's good enough to go in your deck, there should be 3 of them. I mean, the only time that I will include 2 of something is if I've hit 52 cards or 51 cards and I need to trim one thing down. I still want there to be some of them in my deck, but of all the 3 of a kinds that I have in my deck, that one is the one I could do without the most,
sure.
I guess. And there's other things, like on the topic of supports. It's great if you really want Catachans to show up. It's great to put 3 of them in, but there are some supports where, like Staging Ground, let's say, right? Staging Ground is great. It's awesome to have 1 on your board. Do you really need 3? Probably not. Right. So you might only put 2 in because, how many resources and cards you can have in your hand that you would actually need to put 3 dudes into combat in the middle of combat with 3 Staging Grounds, right?
Right.
Or with Ammo Depots, you've got 4 cards in your hand. You play 1, you draw 1. You can't play anymore. You've got 2 Ammo Depots that are choking themselves, basically, right?
Sure.
It's tricky like that. With the only other part of that would be the uniques, and I would say that uniques are tricky because it certainly depends on which unique you're talking about. I know with typically I will put in 2 of a unique. Let's say we're talking about the strong uniques that people would play all the time, like Veteran Brother Maxos and Siren Zithlex from Space Marines and Dark Eldar, respectively. You definitely want to see those people show up. And maybe 3 is too many, I guess. Typically, I find people will put 2 of them in, unless their deck is really, really hinges upon that particular unique. Like
I was going to say,
Space Marines players have a lot of craziness about Maxos.
I mean, Maxos is amazing, first of all. Although, maybe not in a Ragnar deck. But
I don't even see him in Ragnar decks, actually.
Yeah, but talking about whether to go 2 over 3 for the uniques, the Nazdrag deck that did really well at nationals or U.S. nationals was running 3 of Crush Face, which I think is perfectly justified.
Sure.
So,
Well, this is the thing is that, it's unfortunate, particularly when you're staring down at a Siren the Zithlex with 2 damage on it sitting at your HQ. It's really sad that she's down there.
Right.
When you've got a fresh one sitting in your hand and plenty of money to spend on it.
yep.
But, it's better that you've got her on the board than not, I suppose. And, with somebody like Veteran Brother Maxos in particular, you're cool if he's at HQ because he's coming into the combat and his ability still works,
Yeah.
right?
Right.
There's some like Siren Zithlex, which they're pretty awful at HQ, because when you bring them into combat, their ability is useless, right? And I've actually had times where I've done that. I've decided to shield my unique and retreat it when I was losing the battle, and then the next HQ phase I draw another copy of it. And I'm like, oh,
Right.
I would much rather have her out here,
Well, and I think some of that probably comes down to that statistics game where it's kind of a careful balance between if you're running 3 copies of Siren Zithlex in your deck, maybe on occasion she'll end up in your HQ exhausted, but perhaps more often than not she'll end up being killed and then you can conveniently replay her. But I suppose, all of this is just advice. When it comes down to it, do whatever you want to do and definitely experiment with deck building. And certainly things will change quite a lot as we see our card pool expand quite a bit. I suppose when it comes to deck building, I suppose Tau is really the only faction that plays really heavy when it comes to limited cards, but I suppose how do you go about balancing that kind of thing when it comes to promotion, when it comes to recon drones, and then a few different other effects? Like, once we start seeing more and more limited cards, what do you think a decent upper limit might be on that kind of effect?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. I know when Anshi first came out, the first thing I did based on my deck philosophy was just I had 3 promotions, 3 recon drones, and 3 homing beacons in.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the first game I played, I pulled 4 of them in the first turn, and I cried. So I haven't had any problems playing 3 promotions and 3 recon drones, and in that case it's sort of versatile because when you've got a limited card with a shield, it's okay because you can still shield with it even though you've played a limited card
right
in the round. So as long as there are shields on limited cards, then I don't think it'd be too bad. Maybe you pull a recon 2 recon drones in a promotion or something like that, which maybe that's worst case scenario for a deck or something along those lines. But, being able to shield with the promotion, put a recon drone out to win command at a planet, and then annoy your opponent again with another one the next turn is not terrible.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Well, I suppose just kind of rounding out some of the other keywords, like limited is certainly kind of sprinkled on a few different cards, but when you are deck building, do you take any of the common keywords we see into effect? So the Eldar, for instance, don't have much in the way of area effect, but they certainly have lots of mobile. They have a little bit of ranged, especially if you're allied with, say, Dark Eldar, things like that. But for area effect, ranged, armor bane, brutal, are you guys looking to pick units specifically with these abilities, or is it more we just pick units that happen to have these abilities and that's what makes them so appealing? Like, do you kind of build with these keywords in mind, or is it just if they're in your deck incidentally that works?
Generally, for me, I'm not going into it thinking like, oh, I want to build a brutal deck. It's more like, oh, Tech Squad Cardinis is a 2 cost with AoE 1 and 3 hit points.
Sure.
God, that's really good. I'm going to put it in. Having said that, I'm working on a guard deck or whatever, Astra Militarum deck now. I'm just kind of goofing with it just to see how much it works. It is just completely trying to take advantage of the ranged mechanic. I don't know if it's going to be good or not, but it's maximizing a lot of attachments that boost attacks and using Honorifica Imperialis. So in that instance, like just for an experimental, like goofy thing, I am looking for, just anything that has the ranged keyword.
Yeah. Well, it makes me think of the, I suppose I wouldn't really call it tournament competitive, but the Yuri and Rakarth deck that centers around Hypex Injector and just being able to deliver as much ranged attack as possible. Players might even consider something along the lines of a Sybarite Marksman, which is otherwise not an auto-include in really any Dark Eldar decks by any means. I suppose for me, it's more just picking individually powerful cards. Like, I've always just been kind of high efficiency, high value player, not really trying to play for theme or to do cute combos or anything like that. In Raged Orc, for instance, it's very powerful because it's just a good unit. It doesn't necessarily have to have some elaborate synergy built around it.
Yeah.
But any other thoughts before we kind of move along?
Well, there are some keywords that you definitely need to consider. I mean, I don't think that the card pool is mature enough to be able to go, okay, I'm going to pick, like a Dark Eldar deck and just make it really ranged heavy.
Sure.
And you can put some range units in it, like 3 different kinds of range units, I think. But it's not enough to call this is my, shoot first, ask questions later range deck or something like that, right?
Right.
But I mean, like if you're building an on-she deck, you want to look for ethereals. If you are building a Ragnar deck, you may want to look for Space Wolves because of the synergy with him and his signature support and that sort of thing.
Sure.
Those are traits, John, not keywords.
Oh my God.
That's right. So just to clarify, because it's a good point, and I actually learned some new keywords the other day. So traits are things like soldier, warrior, Black Templars. Keywords are things like ranged, area effect, armor bane, brutal, immune, no attachments. I actually just recently learned is a keyword that the Tyranids could potentially copy, which kind of blew my mind. And then, of course, we've seen specializations now, which are not traits. They're not keywords. You can't copy them. It's things like Bloodthirst on Rograk's Bloodhand, Unstoppable on Chaplain Mavros' Signature Squad, and, of course, the Hive Mind specialization. But if you haven't completely lost track of what you were saying, John, by all means, continue.
Well, yes, going back to that and actually being put on the right path, the ranged part that I was talking about was still valid, but I actually got to thinking about keywords a lot when I saw Brood Chamber come out.
Yeah.
Because I have a friend in the local meta who is big on Tyranids and was talking about how great that is. And we got to thinking about what keywords there were and how often you could steal them and if they would be useful and that sort of thing. I think that, it'd be very cool to be able to build a flying deck eventually, but I mean, in the current card pool, if you want to consider a specialization, a keyword, the Swarm Lord definitely needs to consider Hive Mind stuff, and how far they want to delve into that.
Sure.
But I mean, really, the only thing that I thought about was I tried to do some Tau range stuff. Like On-She is pretty big on range guys because if he can, he can surgically remove units with range attacks because they're armor bane. He just goes, okay, that guy's got 4 hit points. Let me put an iron rifle on this Viorla Marksman. Boom, he's gone, right?
Right.
But other than that, I mean, at one point in time, I spent some time thinking about Brutal in Nazdreg because it's redundant. Like thinking, okay, well, if I send Nazdreg to a planet full of enraged orcs and Killikans, why is he there? He's not benefiting them at all, right? So,
sure.
But on the other hand, I could send them to Planet 1 and send Nazdreg somewhere else because they don't need him to be there to get Brutal. But, I mean, that was pretty much the depth of thinking about keywords. The card pool is still young enough that it's like, okay, this guy's pretty cool because he's Brutal, but I'm not going to build like a Brutal deck. I guess it's actually worth mentioning Baharoth, though, because the more mobility in his deck, the better if you're building with Death from Above and trying to benefit from the Banner of the Ashen Sky, his signature support, that sort of stuff. So, building a deck with Tau and a bunch of mobile in it as allies would be great.
Even then, though, there's not... If you look up, and in fact I'll do it right now, if you look up how many mobile units there actually are available to that deck, it's a shockingly low amount.
And even more so the ones that actually are useful with
Good.
Death from Above, right?
So here, you know what? Here, I have it on Conquest DB. I'm not even going to limit by ally. So we have Eldar, Dark Eldar, and Tau, and there are, come on, internet. There are a total, out of all 3 of those factions, there are 5 mobile units available to Baharath, and one of those is his signature unit.
Right.
So really there's 4. There's Soaring Falcon, Vile Raider, Piranha Hunter from Tau, and then Vashia Trailblazer.
Yeah.
So it's not like those units aren't going to make your deck. Yeah, I mean they might make it into the deck. What I mean is they're not going to. It's not like, oh man, I've got these units in. It's game over for my opponent.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
it's like
Piranha Hunter.
It'll irritate the heck out of them, but that's about it. And then they swing for 1.
yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
So-
there's definitely a lot of potential. Like, you know, if you look at like Eldar vehicle units and you can put a star cannon on them, I'd love to see an Eldar vehicle deck someday where you just have crazy star cannon armor bane stuff going around and things like that. But you know, I don't know. I haven't been around for LCGs for very long, but you know, say another couple of cycles and it might actually have some synergy to it all. But until then, you know, like even now, you know, here's some Space Wolves guys. How many people that build a Ragnar deck even put other Space Wolves units in them, other than the signature squad? You know, like you're gonna put a Morkat Root Priest in there.
Yeah.
I haven't seen that in play ever.
Right.
competitively they're just not good. And then there's no. When is Ragnar going to be able to afford? First of all, when is Ragnar going to be able to afford Space Wolves Predator? You know,
Right.
When he puts it in play with his other cards and then doesn't get the reaction to actually fire.
right,
That's about
right.
it.
So when is Ragnar ever going to be able to pay for that? Mind you, in my Kato deck at this last tournament, that was one of my MVP cards, was Space Wolves Predator. It was one of the elites I put in. It was amazing. But I was swimming in resources because it's Kato.
Sure. Well, I suppose just kind of drawing things slowly to an end here, what are some big differences you guys see? And just, you know, let's think of things like whether you're a power gamer, whether you're a hardcore tournament player, or you're just playing a thematic deck that you want any sliver of a hope of winning. What are some of the differences between a good deck and a bad deck?
I think that it really comes down to the cards that are in them and the quantities of those cards. Really, I mean, you know, like there are cards, like cards can sort of be categorized into, I would say, 2 or 3 different categories. There's the, you know, AAA tournament competitive cards. There's the cards that are thematic and are kind of interesting. They like based on what the card is named. The effect of the card really gives you that vibe. And then there are cards that are just kind of fun, you know? And if you've got fun cards in your deck, it'll probably be a fun deck to play, but don't expect to win many tournaments with them. But, you know, like I hate to bring this game into this conversation, but it's like in World of Warcraft. You've got the hardcore raider guys that are there to kick butt. You've got the people that are just in there casually to play and go do some quests and stuff like that. And then there are people that are, you know, like, I don't know what would a third category be, people that are really big on playing the auction house or something like that. You know, they built that game so that it appealed to a large demographic, depending on what kind of gamer you were. And so I think it's good that Conquest has built cards that can appeal to all those kinds of different demographics, even though as a competitive player, I look at some of the cards and say, oh my gosh, that's terrible. Why, what were they thinking, right?
Sure.
But I know that it does appeal to other people that are not as competitive as me or some other personality. But yeah, sorry, getting back to the question, you know, I think that it's probably coming down to the card pool again, and there really are, you know, you could take a couple of not very good cards and throw 3 copies of each of them into a deck, and if everything else was still the same, the deck would still be really darn good. I think that sadly, if I were to answer the difference between a good deck and a bad one right now, it's going to come down to what warlord the person picked. Because if I sit down at a tournament and I'm sitting across from Urian or Zogwart or maybe Colonel Strachan or something like that, I'll say, okay, I got this. But there are other warlords where I look and I say, okay, I need to, pay attention and play my best to beat this person because they're playing Kato or Kith or something like that.
Sure. And all of these statements are made given our current card pool in the context of certainly if you play Strachan or Zogwart, you'll win games, but statistically speaking, you're a little bit less likely to do so. I not too long ago did this grandiose state of the meta video with Sam Mann where we scoured all of the statistical results available at the database that Paul Steiner runs, and just in calculating a couple thousand games worth of stats together, it's something like Urian, the worst performing warlord in a competitive sense, would win on average 4 out of every 10 games, relative to Kith, the best performing warlord, was something like 6 out of every 10. And that's just the most dramatic example. So if you do happen to be a more casual player, if you like Strachan or Urian or whatever warlords you happen to choose, certainly don't abandon all hope, but just given our current card pool, there's always going to be winners, and there's going to be some that lose a little bit more often than the others. But hopefully as our card pool expands and continues to develop, there'll be that ebb and flow where some warlords rise to prominence and some kind of wax and wane and lose their time in the spotlight. But what are your thoughts, Parker? Good deck versus bad deck?
A lot of it, honestly, is going to come down to experience versus inexperienced player. But if we're talking like 2 expert players, each sit down at a table, and one has Urian and one has Kato, I think a lot of those decks that struggle in command. Not saying that you have to necessarily go into, if you're not playing Eldorath, you don't have to go into a game like, all right, I'm going to outcommand Eldorath, because you're probably not, but you got to be able to keep up. And I think a lot of decks that it's like, oh man, I'm going to put in this big unit, I'm going to put in this command unit, or sorry, not command unit, I'm going to put in this fighty unit, I'm going to put in this fighty unit, oh man, I'm going to smash them in combat. No, you're not, because your units are never going to make it there. I think you have to emphasize, and that's a big debate in the community, is the command phase occupying too large a space of the game?
Sure.
You know what, whether it is or not, right now that's the environment, and if you want to win, you gotta acknowledge that, and you gotta play, you gotta have those 1 costs, you gotta have your promotions, you gotta be able to win command.
Sure. I mean, it's just like complaining that certain cards are overpowered, whether they are or not. The state of the matter is they're not restricted or anything like that in a tournament format, so you're going to have to face them, so, deal with it, essentially.
Just practice against it, that's all.
Sure. Right. Know what to expect and do as much as you can to anticipate it and play around it. But kind of shifting topics here, something that I continue to struggle with, as I'm certainly the most inexperienced player of the cast here. What exactly do you guys look for in an opening hand? So something that is probably my most significant area of weakness is I interview people all the time. I understand a lot of combos, a lot of advanced gameplay and things of that nature, but when I look at my opening hand, oftentimes I'm kind of at a bit of a loss for, should I mulligan, should I not? What do you guys look for when you look at your first 6, 7, or 8 cards?
So I actually wrote an article about this. You guys can find it on wwpd.net. And just to paraphrase, in that opening hand, for me anyway, I'm looking for, well, first of all, you have to look at the planet lineup. I'm going to bring this back to deck building.
Sure.
He's just going to say it depends.
Yeah. You got to look at the planet lineup. Generally, you have to make the decision, am I going to fight for Planet 1 right away, or am I going to wait to bring the pain for a little bit? But either way, you're going to have to get some command presence out on the table. And I'll talk about the best opening hand that I had at the tournament this past weekend. Like I said, I was playing Kato, looked at the planet lineup, saw preferably I would like to be able to put up a fight on planet 1. So let's now look at my opening hand. 10th Company Scout, 10th Company Scout, Rogue Trader, Void Pirate, Blood Angels Vet. And I'm like, yep, I'll keep.
Sure.
Those 5 were all in my opening hand. I had a couple other events, and that was just instantaneous. I love having a Blood Angels Vet on turn 1, man. They're so good.
Yeah, any hand where you can put out a command icon on every planet and have a decent combat unit at the first planet, that is golden.
Sure.
For sure.
And that's an extreme example.
Particularly in Space Marines, yeah.
Yeah, even if it was, like, say I did want to fight for that first planet, even if my opening hand was 10th Company Scout, Void Pirate, Blood Angels Vet, depending on what other events I have, maybe if I have a promotion in hand, I'm probably going to keep that. Just the chances of getting something definitely better are not high. But that comes down to having a good cost curve for your deck, having those, like, a balance between command and fighty units in your deck, and having the events where you can have a backup plan,
Sure. Well, and I think part of it definitely depends on the opposition, and by no means am I an expert throwing this out there, but I recently played a game against a Chaos player, and as Ragnar, my opening hand was something like, Rogue Trader, Void Pirate, and then maybe my most formidable combat unit was like a Rattling Deadeye, and when you're up against potentially so much direct damage effects, I definitely wanted something with a little bit more of a body to it that could actually stick around and just not be nuked out of existence.
Right.
But any other thoughts just on opening hand first, before you even start playing the game?
Yeah, I think I'd like to add on what Parker said of it a little bit, but definitely the planet lineup is a consideration. It's going to influence how you play the game, especially if the draw 3 cards, 3 resources planet is out, because you can purposefully underplay your cards and then go there to trigger it.
Right.
But like if Planum is out, particularly if it's Planet 1 or something like that,
sure,
you want to be able to put a big beefy unit there, because if your opponent doesn't have one, they go to any other planet, they're going to be facing that beefy unit regardless of what they want, whether they want to or not.
Sure.
The other thing to consider is the command strength of the faction you're playing against. Like, particularly as Eldorath, if I've got, 3 single command icon command units that I can play out against, say, Space Marines, I'm okay. But if I'm playing against Kith or Astra Militarum or something like that are stronger on command, if I don't have a couple of 2 command icon guys, I maybe consider mulliganing.
Sure.
And then...
Well...
Oh, sorry. And you also have to consider... So there was 2 more points I was going to consider. One of them is what you can get out for the 7 resources you've got, or 6 resources, or 8, depending on who you're playing as. And then the other thing is the worst part of this game is when you don't draw more units, right? Like, if you've got units that you can afford to play, that's great. But if you play out all your units and all you have left are events and you don't draw any more units, you've got a big problem. So, on the one hand, having 6 units and only being able to play 3 of them kind of stinks, but because you've got 2 stuck in your hand still, but chances are you'll be able to play them out next turn anyway.
Sure.
And at least you've got units to replace the ones that you lost, or, support them or something along those lines, which is a lot better than the alternative.
Yeah. Well, something you said prompted me to remember that I just got crushed recently by a very strong Tau player, and he happened to mention just a little nice rule of thumb was to really dig for like 2 command icon units in the early game, just because of Vashya, Trailblazer, Recon Drone, things like that. Being able to fill the board with Rattling Deadeye, Rogue Trader, Void Pirates, all of those, it was just, I'd play a unit and then he'd 2 command trumpet and play another unit unit, 2 command trumpet. So just definitely being very cognizant of what exactly your opponent can play. And just a couple more topics I'd like to cover before we close things out here. Earlier we were talking about the number of cards to include in your deck, but something I forgot to ask, it's a very controversial topic, but our very much tarnished, tainted North American national champion included 1 copy of Wild Rider Squadron in his deck. Granted, he was drawing more cards than the average player, but how do you guys feel about single copy cards outside of your signature squad?
Generally, I don't like them.
Like, is there ever a case when you'd use it? Personally, I am extraordinarily hesitant.
I think that they can be very interesting because your opponent doesn't see them coming. You know,
Like neither may you.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, you're not always going to have them when you want, but like I know I was running Seer's Exodus, 1 copy of Seer's Exodus for a while, or a Craft World Gate, just to do things like, Kato sends himself to a planet where I have a Void Pirate, and I'll Craft World Gate and put the Void Pirate back in my hand to deny him the resource that he might have been relying on.
Sure.
Another one that I run, 1 of or 2 of, depending, is Doom. Because, I know that when you're playing against an Eldar player, the threat of Doom is very scary. It makes you not want to overcommit, which is actually really nice when I overcommit.
Sure.
But there have been times where just the Doom is just so good. Like people say that it's a catch-up mechanic, but you can really play it strategically to ruin somebody's day. I mean, I've had times where I would, I would put a couple of units at Planet 1 to make my opponent send his Warlord back to that planet with his Warlord train, even though I knew that they were going to die horribly.
Right.
Just to set it up so that when he has finished that combat and I've gone to Planet 3 or something like that, I can Doom. And I've just had, like, there was one game where I was playing where it was the last turn, I had seven units at Planet 1 that were ready, and they had 11 units in their HQ. And I had Doom in my hand, and I played that out, and they're like, good game.
Yeah. I recently witnessed one where somebody did 2 Dooms in a row, back to back, where it was just,
ouch.
They punished the initial overextension, and then the opponent, figuring they were all clear, ended up, getting their head chopped off once again. But Parker, it's my understanding you've got to take off a little bit early, but any closing thoughts, anything else you'd want to share or plug before you get out of here?
I would definitely say don't be afraid to go on the forums, go on the Facebook page, and post a deck and just ask people for their advice. By and large, the community is very friendly and responsive. And so I don't, most of all, just don't be afraid to ask for deck building advice. We're always ready to blow hot air and, talk deck building. At least I am. I could talk about deck building for a long ass time.
Definitely. So, thank you so much for coming on, Parker. I'd love to have you back, if not next episode, sometime, but have a fantastic evening and take care.
Appreciate it, man. I had a great fucking time.
Save that for the end. I like it.
See you later, guys. I gotta sign off.
See you later, Parker.
Later.
Well, John, I suppose before the 2 of us get out of here, one last thing I wanted to touch on really quickly is just the concept of net decking. Certainly as a new player, I kind of compensate for some of my inexperience by saving time is how I view it, looking at what other players have already been successful with, what they've done some playtesting with, what has been proven to be effective. But I suppose what's your just personal stance on going online, punching in, keyword overpowered, broken, hitting search, and then building that deck?
I think net decking is great, personally. I mean, I don't necessarily look for the decks that are overpowered and like the best in the meta and that sort of thing. In fact, I actually will purposely stay away from them, typically. Like, I don't really want to play Kith because I know everyone else is going to be playing her.
Sure.
But I mean, getting back to net decking, if you're, let's say you're trying out a new faction or you're new to the game, taking a deck that someone has used to great effect and been successful with is fantastic. The fact that you can just hop right in is great. And it's sort of like, there's the deck, which is sort of like your car, and then there's the player, which is like the driver, right? It's nice to be able to start off in a nice sports car and learn how to drive it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And depending on with a different faction, if you're not familiar with the faction, to be able to get in and go, okay, this is what a good deck from Zarather looks like, let's say.
Sure.
Maybe I'm not familiar with the card pool from Chaos, and I'm learning their tricks as I go. And as you have played your games and find out what works and what doesn't work for you, or what you'll be able to see things that you say, okay, why doesn't this deck have this, or it needs more of this, and you can tweak it and make it your own, and that's great. And in a card pool that is this small, I guess you can say, it's only going to take those small tweaks for the most part to make the deck your own and make it how you want it to play. So I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of view it as, I suppose, just an analogy is like training wheels, where if you just try to get on the bike without any sort of help at all, you might just collapse. Your deck might completely malfunction. You may have way too little command, or just, your Ragnar deck is full of Space Wolves, Predators, and Bloodclaw packs, and things that might look good on paper, but they don't just quite work out too terribly well in practice. So I think it just kind of leverages conditions in your favor and helps struggling or inexperienced players get off the ground quickly, and then, once you're more comfortable, experiment from there. But I suppose, thank you so much for being on today, John, on the first episode here.
No problem.
Any closing thoughts or any plugs that you'd like to toss out there? Any last words?
I think I'm good, actually.
Sure.
But thanks for having me.
Not a problem. And I suppose to all the listeners at home, I'll just say thank you so much for checking out the very first episode of the Tyrantcast. Huge thanks to John Gobeil and Parker Ince for suffering through an hour and 20 minutes or so of interacting with me. But, thanks for checking out the video. Of course, I'd love to hear ideas that you have for future episodes in the comments. If there's a topic you'd like to hear from any of these guests about, or if you'd like to see rotating guests on, let us know what discussion topics you'd like addressed. But of course, if at any point you'd like to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Facebook, and of course, if you subscribe to this channel, if you like the content I produce, all of it kind of spreads it around. It makes it more viral. More people stumble upon the content. They might see Conquest. They might be interested in it. They might give the game a try, like what they see, end up joining our community. And of course, Fantasy Flight Games gets an extra couple dollars and continues to support this fantastic game. I'll just say, if at any point you feel like just supporting me, contributing to my file hosting operating expenses, I'm on Patreon. But I'll just close things out by saying thank you as always for watching, and as ever, be sure to check back in again soon for ever more Conquest LCG content to come.